these are desperate measures where they're thinking of a kind of fiscal Berlin Wall, somehow trying to make sure that you can't escape it. It's fair to say that would not cause a colossal amount of economic damage because hardly anyone would even pay it, but also it would hardly produce any revenue. So then it's just completely pointless and symbolic. With Gary Stevenson even saying he's only interested in the top 0.1%, so narrowing it down even further.
Unemployment is creeping up. It's still not at panic levels, but it's gone up again this month to 4.8%.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Daniel Freeman, Managing Editor here at the IEA. Today I'm joined by Kristian Niemietz, our Editorial Director, and in spirit by Len Shackleton, our Head of Labour Economics. Today we'll be discussing the Green Party's plans for a wealth tax, why unemployment in the UK is rising, and the winner of this year's Nobel Prize in Economics, and how their work can inform policy in Britain. So our first topic is the one that you selected, Kristian. This is Zack Polanski, the newly elected leader of the Greens, has a plan for a wealth tax.
He does.
Tell us more.
Well, he had a bit of a Twitter spat with our former colleague, Matt Bowles, who's written an article for The Spectator in which he just explained why a wealth tax is a bad idea. So his article wasn't specifically about Zack Polanski, but The Spectator, quite legitimately, they want a few clicks for the article, so they put him in the headline, and it said, Zack Polanski is talking nonsense on the wealth tax, and he saw that, and it resulted in a bit of a Twitter spat where Polanski then said, well, you're just saying this because you are owned by a billionaire, and this is all billionaire funded propaganda. The billionaires don't want to pay taxes, blah blah, which is a bit ironic because I think on the same day or minutes before, Polanski was complaining about the fact that his opponents are not engaging with him on content, that they're just attacking him personally. Which, okay, to be fair, some have done that. I've seen some of that. It does happen, yes.
The hypnotism stuff.
Some of that.
I mean, he does make it easy to attack him on personal grounds, I suppose.
Yeah, there could be, there's more difficult examples to find. But yeah, I mean, some of that is a bit on the humorous side. Some of it is a bit silly. Some people have been attacking him for changing his family name as if that was somehow something dodgy. But yeah, that aside, he made that point that his critics aren't engaging on content. But then, well, Matt Bowles very much was. I mean, this is purely on content. This is purely critiquing one of his flagship policy, at least you would say. And then, rather than responding to the criticism, because it was the article was making some serious economic arguments, he was then just I guess attacking our colleague personally, saying, well, you're a stooge for the billionaires, and you're just a gun for hire. You're just doing their bidding. So what Matt said in the article was a fairly common economic argument. So he was first of all talking about the French experience with wealth taxes, because they had something that looks quite similar to what Zack Polanski is now proposing, and other proponents of the wealth tax too. And that quite predictably did lead to capital flight and the usual problems that we associate with wealth taxes, high admin costs, high deadweight loss costs attached. That's all the classics. What mainstream economics would predict. And he also made the point that there is the valuation issue, that you have some assets that are just very difficult to value because they're not frequently traded or sometimes never. So say this building here, how much is this building worth? Nobody knows because it hasn't been traded since the 1960s or so. And therefore you need some valuation bureaucracy. And they come up with numbers, and that they're subject to challenges, and then you have legal cases around it. And because of all that admin overhead, that in itself is a reason why a wealth tax probably isn't worth the trouble. And this is real. This isn't just the musings of Matt Bowles, and in this case, he's basing this on real world experience. So that was exactly the issue with the old West German wealth tax. They had that issue that if somebody has, say, an investment fund, a pension fund, whatever, there you can work out very easily, okay, this is worth this much, and therefore on a given date, therefore this is the tax that you pay. And okay, fair enough. But there are assets that are hard to value, businesses, and in some cases property. And some of those, at least business wealth, that is a bigger and bigger share as you go up to wealth distribution. So precisely the people who you want to, or who the proponents of a wealth tax want to target with that tax, they are also the ones whose assets are hardest to value. And that was an issue in the West German case that they had. What it meant in practice, what difficult to value means in practice, is that the valuations are usually out of date. And that was the reason why the West German wealth tax was ultimately struck down as unconstitutional, because the Constitutional Court realized at some point, they said, well, look, this is nonsense. You may have people with identical wealth levels, but very different tax burdens, simply because some people have their valuations up to date, so they would pay a lot. Others, the valuation is years behind, so they pay very little. And because of that inequality, they didn't say you have to abolish it. They didn't tell the government you need to scrap this tax. They just told them you need to sort out these valuation issues.
So you'd have to have everyone having an up-to-date valuation,
yes,
which presumably would be really quite expensive to administer.
Yes, and that's why the government, rather than they would have had the choice in principle, the Kohl government in the 90s, they would have had the option in principle to just say, well, okay, we'll get the valuations up to date, and that's how we make it compatible with this ruling. Then the Constitutional Court will accept it. They just realized immediately this isn't worth the trouble, especially because, so in the 90s, it was already an issue in the 80s. They never applied the wealth tax to East Germany later, because there, of course, all of those problems are a multiple of it, because for obvious reasons, nothing had market values. And then how do you apply a wealth tax then? And that's why they didn't even bother trying. And that's why they said, okay, this just isn't worth it. Let's just drop the whole thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And because it's not just West Germany that's dropped the wealth tax in the last sort of 3 decades. An awful lot of OECD countries have dropped theirs. And is it a sort of similar process in most of them? Is that
Yes.
It's just difficult to...
Yeah, so there are a number of reasons that come up time and again. If you look at why did they abolish it, and that there's OECD reports on this, it's always, not much revenue, high admin costs, valuation difficulties, capital flight. And it's always, you see this, it's also governments of very different ideological persuasions. So it's not that you have just Thatcherites and Reaganites saying we don't like this for ideological reasons. It can be centrist governments, left-wing governments even, and just from their rhetoric on the wealth tax, you couldn't tell where they are really ideologically.
And it's not as if we've consistently seen across the OECD a big fall in overall tax takes as a percentage of GDP. In fact, often the reverse. It's just many governments seem to have shifted away from wealth taxes just because it's a really inefficient way of collecting revenue, it seems. Now, if one of the things you sometimes hear from defenders of wealth tax, when people refer to the idea that, it's going to lead to people leaving the country, selling everything, getting out of the country, the response is often, well, that's a good thing, because then they won't be able to take their assets. They'll stay in the country, and so we'll just get nice, cheap assets. That's one of the lines you sometimes hear from like Gary Stevenson.
Yes, and Matt Bowles picked up on that as well in the article. So yes, that is sometimes there, the get-out clause from defenders of the wealth tax. So they will say, well, okay, the people can leave, but the assets are still there. So the physical asset can't be moved. So where's the problem? Well, one of the problems is they don't even necessarily have to sell them. You could just move abroad, and then you would be an overseas owner. You would just no longer be a resident of this country and therefore no longer be liable to taxation here, but you can still be an asset owner. Now, of course, you can then have second order legislation where they would then say, okay, but
overseas,
you can't own anything unless you are a tax resident here. So you could then have this whole interventionism spiral where they try to address that. But yeah, absolutely. In the first instance, you could just have people saying, well, okay, in that case, I'm no longer a resident of this country. Bye. Which, okay, that would not be a literal goodbye, because Dan Needle pointed this out in his paper on the wealth tax. That a particularity of this country is also that if you go very high up the wealth distribution, you have a lot of people who already divide their time between several countries. So it's not that they live here year round. They spend some of their time here, some of their time in wherever, California or whatever. And it would just mean adjusting that slightly. So once you go below, I think it's 90 days or so per year, you are no longer a permanent resident of this country, and then you are no longer liable to taxation here. Now, of course, what you could do, and some of the wealth tax defenders are thinking about this, you could try to have something like an exit tax, where you pay tax once you leave the country or cease to be an official resident of the country, or something where there is a delayed effect where you are still subject to taxation.
As with US citizens, for example.
Yes, that would be the extreme case. Yeah. In their case, it's lifelong unless you really give up the citizenship. But yeah, these are desperate measures where they're thinking of a kind of fiscal Berlin Wall, somehow trying to make sure that you can't escape it.
And also, presumably, with an exit tax proposal, if that becomes even seriously discussed, a serious prospect, a lot of people are going to race to leave before that. So you get a lot of the sort of capital flight you would anyway before that. I mean, yeah, I think that's a very good point in terms of just how mobile internationally the very, very rich as people are, particularly in the UK. But one of the interesting things I actually find about Zack Polanski's proposal, well, as it's been outlined in his leadership acceptance speech, was that on the face of it, it seems a lot more broad than some of the other wealth tax proposals we've seen on, say, assets above 10 million. So he talked about we need to have a wealth tax on the top 1%. Now, in the UK, the top 1%, to be in the top 1% of earners, you only need to be earning about £150,000, or the top 1% of adults. So that, I mean, some of these people will have more than £10 million in assets, but, that would seem to be a much, much broader section of the population than some of the more, the kind of more moderate, if you want to call them, proposals for a wealth tax.
Yeah, it could be that he just wasn't thinking this through, that he just went rhetorically, because there has been this Occupy slogan years ago, which never quite died out, the 99% versus the 1%, whereas the wealth taxes were usually saying assets above 10 million, or some even using an even higher threshold. And with Gary Stevenson even saying he's only interested in the top 0.1%, so narrowing it down even further. So you have that contradiction. It could be that he was just messing up the old Occupy slogan with the new trendy thing, which is the wealth tax movement, and that he didn't actually mean the top decile or even percentile of the wealth distribution. But yes, that would be the implication. You can raise more revenue through a wealth tax if you broaden it out and include more people. But then, of course, the economic damage also becomes larger, and that is the trade-off. If you do it in the way that some of the proponents talk about, is only the billionaires, where that's maybe 200 people or so, then yes, okay, it's fair to say that would not cause a colossal amount of economic damage, because hardly anyone would even pay it. But also, it would hardly produce any revenue. So then it's just completely pointless and symbolic.
Well, that does sound like quite a few policies floating around from the Greens and other parties as well. So yeah, we'll carry on following that. Earlier this week, I spoke to the IEA's head of labour economics, Professor Len Shackleton, about the concerning increase in unemployment figures that were announced on Tuesday. If you are watching this on YouTube, the video is slightly out of focus, so I do apologise for that. So we will hopefully do better next time. So what's happening to unemployment?
Well, unemployment is creeping up. It's still not at panic levels, but it's gone up again this month to 4.8%, which is Pace Mr. Streeting is still a lot better than most European countries, but it's the trend which worries you, and particularly the fact that unemployment is growing fastest amongst young people. And we know some of the reasons for this, clearly, that the increase in national insurance contributions, employer national insurance contributions, raise the cost of employing labour, new rules about unfair dismissal from day one, and so forth, make it a risky business taking on new entrants to the labour market. The 0 hours thing as well, that's another thing, because often young people get their first experience through 0 hours work in supermarkets and so forth. So there's a mix of factors. Minimum wages, that's another one which has risen to levels which are unprecedented, really, and as a proportion of median earnings are higher than most other countries in the world. So there's a whole load of things which are actually worsening the position of young people in the labour market, who are trying to get into the labour market. And the problem is, of course, that people who get who get dissuaded from work because of the difficulties of finding it, find it very difficult to change that mindset over time. And labour economists talk a lot of scarring. The scarring effects of being unemployed when you're young last for a long time. So it is worrying, Dan. Unemployment, I say, not yet at the sort of 1930s levels or anything, but the trend is a worrying one.
Yeah. I suppose when it comes to young people being out of the labour market, you also have the issue that it's really difficult to get back in the sense that if you've been unemployed for the first 5 years of your working life, it becomes even more of a risk to hire you again.
Absolutely. And this is true. I'm thinking here of all sorts of young people, but graduates are a problem. If you don't get into a graduate job fairly early in your 20s, then it's going to be much more difficult to break in later on, because your peers will have accumulated experience and so forth, and they'll always stand a better chance of anything that's going than you do.
Yeah. Defenders of the government would probably say, OK, the situation has got slightly worse. Its unemployment has gone from 4.7% to 4.8%. But it looks like it may be bottoming out, that the situation may not get much worse than it already is. Do you buy that take?
I don't really buy that, because I think that's whistling to keep your spirits up to a large extent. We shall see. We've got the budget coming up. What's going to be in the budget will, I think, have an effect on employers' willingness to take people on, and it could further demoralise employers and also self-employed people. A thing which I keep coming back to when I discuss this is that the number of people who are self-employed is still well below that pre-COVID. And self-employment is a way in for some young people to get into employment, but it's also a very important way of keeping older people in the labour market for longer. And one of the encouraging things really pre-COVID was that older people were continuing to work to 70 and beyond, through the medium of self-employment, often professional people who were able to parlay their experience into self-employment. Now, if we find that this is, being discouraged for all sorts of reasons, like IR35, for example, that's one problem, and all this. And this,
Could you explain what IR35 is?
Yes, it's really about the status of self-employment. And if you're working for a single
firm,
then are you an employee or are you not? And the way in which the rules have been drawn about this in recent years has created a lot of problems for people who may temporarily be working for some more or less exclusively for somebody, but in the longer term are really self-employed people. I mean, that's one set of problems. The other is that the government are imposing this thing called making tax digital, which involves self-employed people having to send in very frequent, tax returns, not just at the end of the year, as traditionally self-employed people have done. And the level at which this kicks in terms of earnings is falling.
Yeah.
So this is increasing the pressure on people who are perhaps only continuing with work, and is it worth the hassle of carrying on with these new requirements? So there are things like that which worry me as well.
Yeah.
But we will see, the budget is going to be crucial, I think, in affecting the psychology of employers, self-employed people, and indeed of workers themselves.
Yeah. So you've talked about some of the headwinds that are acting against employment and increasing the level of employment in the economy. What are some of the things that the government could do in the November budget to, build confidence again among business?
Well, it's a question of what they shouldn't do, I think, very largely. And that what they shouldn't do is impose yet more tax in a way which is going to discourage enterprise of all kinds. And really, the government really has to get serious about looking for spending cuts and looking for ways in which you can reduce the role of the state. But whether the Labour Party is capable of doing this looks very doubtful to me. I mean, we've seen the furore around the really marginal cuts which were attempted in welfare payments. If you can't do something as small as that, to make big changes to the size of the gap which we got between spending and taxation is going to be very difficult indeed.
Well, on that somber note, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you, Len.
Well, this week we also had the Nobel Prize in Economics being announced, and it went to Philippe Aghion, Peter Howard, and Joel Mokyr. Daniel, you've read a bit about some of Joel Mokyr's work. What can you tell us about that?
Well, this caused a lot of excitement among the people I follow on Twitter, mostly because I follow an awful lot of economic historians. And Joel Mokyr in particular has been hugely, hugely influential in our understanding of how modern economic growth originated, how we started to expect sort of steady per capita growth year after year and decade after decade. Now, we have had economic growth through all periods of history, but it's tended to be very ephemeral. It's you have 100 years maybe of efflorescence, maybe because climatic conditions are improving, but then that tends to fizzle out. So we see this in like the Italian Italy in say the 13th and 14th century. You get growth, but then it recedes again. This really changes in the 18th century. And among economic historians, it's not very controversial as to why at a very high level. It's because of what we call Schumpeterian growth. So it's primarily driven by improvements in technology, primarily things like steam power, the development of the factory system, improvements in metallurgy. But the big question is, why does this happen in the 18th century, and why does it happen in England and not somewhere else? Why doesn't this happen in, say, India or the Middle East or China, which had, through various points in history, been, fairly technologically advanced, fairly prosperous? And what Mokyr really focuses on is the intellectual culture that exists in Britain. That's why one of his most famous books is called A Culture of Growth. And what he says is that in England and Western Europe more broadly, during the Enlightenment, you get the development of this kind of idea that technological progress is something that is inevitable, or it's something that is good. Innovation is something that you should pursue, which sounds quite obvious in some ways to us, but throughout most stages of human history, there is very often an idea that if you want to know more, you have to look further back. So if you want to know about medicine, you have to read Galen. If you want to know about the natural world, you have to read Aristotle. This really starts to break down in the 17th and very much so in the 18th century in Britain. But what's also important, and what separates England out from other parts of the world, is you have this elite innovative culture, but that is also connected with a kind of is both interested in production. So it's not just focused on, say, astronomy or theoretical physics or the natural world. It's really, really interested in how you get better agricultural yields, how you're able to get more coal, experimentation and tinkering with machinery and equipment that you can use to
commerce and production are no longer dirty words.
Yeah.
They're part of the process.
Yeah, they're united in a way that isn't true in, say, 16th century 16th century Italy. So there's that element. Another element I think that is really quite relevant today is the idea that skills and education are important, but not in the way that British politicians tend to talk about skills or education. If a politician today starts talking about that, it's usually because they're thinking, oh, well, we need to sort of pull a particular lever, spend some money so people do more of X thing.
Yeah, 70% graduates.
Yeah, well, exactly. And Mockit's point is actually England in the 18th century is not an extraordinarily well-educated country by a lot of the traditional measures. So we actually have a literacy rate among men that is much lower than countries like Sweden or Prussia that don't really start to industrialize for another century or more. And in fact, even if you look at 18th century China, male literacy rates there are about 40%, which is almost as high as in England. You have a huge number of private schools and a huge number of highly educated, what we now think of as graduates. You have in 1800, 1.4 million graduates. The difference is in China, in particular, is this is very top down, and it's producing people for basically exclusively for the civil service, of which the Chinese...
That sounds a bit like today, elite overproduction.
Well, yeah. I mean, you think we have it bad today. In China in 1800, you have 1.4 million people competing for about 20,000 civil service jobs.
Wow.
And the entire education system is built around your ability to do well in these exams and basically nothing else. Whereas what Mockit has focused on, and what one of his most interesting papers is actually this, the sorts of skills that are useful in the Industrial Revolution are not really the skills being taught in English universities. What he has found is that what you really need is things like a lot of millwrights. So a millwright is a sort of craftsman who works repairing a mill, like a water mill or a windmill. And these people are overwhelmingly not university educated. In some cases, they're quite literally illiterate. But what Mockit found is that you can very, very closely track the areas in Britain that have the most of these mill rights with the areas that industrialize most quickly, because basically they have the sort of technical skills that, even though they're trained on water mills, they actually can be applied really, really well to early factories or early steam engines, and this is hugely useful when industrialization sort of really kicks off in the 18th century. And it's not that anyone in British politics in 1700 was thinking, oh, we're going to have we need to be ready for the Industrial Revolution, so we need to train lots of millwrights. No, it was a demand side thing. Mm-hmm. There was lots of demand for these workers in the British economy because there were lots of mills in England by comparison to other countries, and therefore this work was relatively well paid. People would apprentice their children to do this, and so you get lots of them. And this gets us on to actually the third point that I think is useful from Mockir's work, is that institutions and what politicians do still really matters, because even if you have this sort of culture of growth, politicians can still bugger it up, and having bad institutions can bugger it up. So part of the reason that England has lots of mills is that it has relatively secure property rights, mm-hmm. compared to, say, Bas van Bavel has done a lot of work on the Middle East, where in the Middle East, in the Middle Ages, while Europe is starting to build lots more mills, lots more capital equipment, in the Middle East, the number of mills actually starts to decline noticeably. And what that seems to be is that there is a lot of regime uncertainty. There's a lot of coups. There's a lot of rulers being overthrown. And in turn, this means that property rights are in practice pretty weak. And that causes big problems if you want to invest in capital, especially something like a mill, where it's a big initial investment and the returns are quite steady, but not very high. So if there's a good chance that if you build a mill, in 5 years' time, the ruler is going to come along and expropriate it, or it's going to be destroyed in a war or whatever, it's really not rational for you to invest in that capital, because there's a very good chance you're not going to see a return on this. Whereas in England, because you have centuries and centuries of fairly strong property rights, you get more investment in mills, which means you have more demand for these sorts of skills, which then have various other, that those skills can be transferred into other industries that people weren't even thinking of in say 1720.
Yeah, well, that all sounds like there's a lot of modern day parallels. A lot of this sounds like it's still relevant for today. So especially the point, have a skill mix which is dominated by the sorts of skills which are in high demand, and these can often be more technical skills rather than more degrees in post-colonial and gender studies. And then have secure property rights, for which could, I guess, mean don't put a wealth tax on today's version of what the mills would have been in earlier centuries. And so I know that there's been some back and forth among economic historians on the relative importance of cultural factors versus institutional factors, and the question of how they interact. Does an entrepreneurial culture shape institutions, or is it the other way around? Now, I don't know enough about this to say I'm on this team or on that team. I'm just glad that domestic factors, that is now the focus, and that gets this recognition. Because just last week, I think it was last week, it was Lenny Henry, the comedian, who published a book where he also indirectly talked about the Industrial Revolution, except he made the point, of course, he picked up again on this idea that it was all the profits from the slave trade, and that is what really industrialized Britain. And he well, he goes for a stronger version of that. He also says, and this is not just what industrialized the country and made Britain rich, but this is also what caused racism. And therefore, Britain today owes reparations not just to Caribbean and African governments, but also to every black citizen who lives in the country. Now, I hope that at least some people will see a bit of the contradiction here between these more fashionable ideas that Western wealth is basically ill-gotten gains and basically the result of plunder, exploitation, and the people who stress the domestic factors, whether domestic mostly means culture of the Enlightenment 18th century, or whether that is institutional factors or a mix of the two. But as long as we're talking about domestic factors and really think about what make the West different from the rest of the world, that's a good thing. More of that.
I should say there are other domestic views that run kind of counter to Mock's argument. So there's also, Robert Allen's idea that the real that places a lot more emphasis on material factors in Britain. So things like Britain already had unusually high wages in 1700 and cheap coal and relatively cheap capital by comparison to other countries. That means it makes more sense to invest more in capital rather than in more labor. Mock here kind of challenges that on the basis that, if you have really cheap labor in an economy, you will tend to use more of it. So that ends up balancing out because it means that you still have an incentive to spend lots on capital because you're hiring people to, work 60 hours a week rather than 50 or whatever.
Yeah, I never found that argument convincing. So I don't know the statistics of the 18th century, but even today, this sounds far too much like the people who say, oh, well, let's somehow cut off the labor supply, whether that's through the visa system or something else. Let's make labor super scarce, and then you will somehow get productivity gains. If that would not work today in today's economy, then I doubt the rules of economics were totally different 200 years ago.
Okay. Right. Well, I think we will call it a day there. I do hope you've enjoyed listening. If you have, do remember to subscribe and give us 5 stars and all that. Also, please subscribe to our Substack, where all of our written work is published. But until then, I will see you next week.